everybody, or a good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Carmine Soprano. I'm an economist, currently working as gender and trade specialist for the World Bank Group, and I'm honored and humbled to be the chair of this extraordinary panel on politics and economics for gender equality in the context of the 11th edition of the Diplomacy Festival here in Rome. We have a really outstanding lineup of highly distinguished speakers from all sides of the board, diplomacy, academia, and the private sector. And we really want to have a concrete discussion about where things stand on the front of gender equality and what really remains to be done going ahead. Now, you will have seen that the main theme of the event is after a century of voting rights to women. And there's a clear reason for that. Many folks will remember 2020 as the year of COVID-19, but fortunately enough, there's a lot more positive things to celebrate this year for. One of which happens to be the 100th anniversary of the universal suffrage in the United States. On August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution was passed, establishing the legal right to vote for all American citizens, irrespective of their sex. Now, this event is widely regarded by scholars and feminist movements as a landmark achievement in the battle for the rights of women that occupied most of the 20th century and continues up to date. And so we really thought that celebrating that anniversary could be the opportunity to have a wide-ranging conversation from all angles of the story: politics, economics, history, and academia and the private sector, in terms of where we stand after 100 years from that memorable moment. So that being said, I think we can go straight into our first speaker, who is Professor Elisabetta Vezzosi. She is Professor of US History and of History of Gender and Women in Modern and Contemporary Age at the University of Trieste. And she's very well placed not only to give us a historical perspective about the meaning of this event 100 years after, but also in terms of broadening the space to discussion on where things stand on the broader gender equality agenda. So Professor Vezzosi, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the presentation. So I will give you an historical perspective. Suffragism in the United States has a very long story. It opened the road women would need to gain genuine political power. The women's suffrage movement had incredible range. It was sustained and transformed through massive political, social, and economic change in American life, and carried forward by at least three generations of American women. Suffragists began the organized fight for women's equality in 1948, when they demanded the right to vote during the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. They, mostly women but some men, gathered in Seneca Falls to discuss the problem of women's rights, not just vote, but civil rights, economic rights, and so on. They were invited there by the reformers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Most of the delegates to the Seneca Falls Convention agreed. American women were autonomous individuals who deserved their own political identities. So I quote what they said in the Declaration of Sentiments, that was the documents they produced during the Seneca Falls Convention. And it is beautiful, this definition of Declaration of Sentiments, but was very political. So I quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End of quote. What this meant, among other things, what they believed women should have the right to vote. For the next 72 years, women leaders lobbied, marched, and protested for the right to the ballot. In the 19th century, of all sorts of reform groups were proliferating across the United States. Temperance leagues, religious movement, moral reform societies, anti-slavery organizations where women were very important and very numerous. And in many of these, women played a prominent role. Meanwhile, many American women were beginning to rebel against what historians have called the, I quote, cult of true womanhood, end of quote. That is the idea that the only true woman was a pious, submissive wife and mother concerned exclusively with home and family. Put together, all of this contributed to a new wave of thinking about what it means to be a woman and a citizen of the United States. In 1869, after the Civil War, a new group called National Woman Suffrage Association was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony. The National Woman Suffrage Association fought for a universal suffrage amendment to the US Constitution. But another group, the American Woman Suffrage Association, fought for the vote on a state-by-state basis. So what was a different strategy? So this agreement, overstretched strategy, threatened to cripple the movement more than once. This animosity eventually faded, and in 1890, the two groups merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the organization's first president. But were not simply Stanton and Anthony who led the movement for voting rights in the country. Women of color, so African American women, working class women, and immigrant women also paved the way. By 1960s, almost all of the major suffrage organizations were united for the goal of a US constitutional amendment. So was born the National Women's Party with Alice Paul, and by then the suffragist approach had changed. Instead of arguing that women deserved the same rights and responsibilities as men, because women and men were, I quote, created equal, end of quote, the new generation of activists argued that women deserved the vote because they were different from men. They could make their domesticity into a political virtue, using the franchise to the vote to create a pure, more moral, maternal commonwealth. And so just because they were mothers or potential mothers, they had the moral attitude to be very political. This argument served many political agenda. Temperance advocates, for instance, wanted women to have the vote because they thought it would mobilize an enormous voting bloc on behalf of their cause. And many middle-class white people were swayed once again by the argument that the vote of white women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy. So for this reason, there was a fracture between white and African American women in the battle for the vote. On May 21, 1919, the US House of Representatives finally approved what was called the Susan Anthony Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote. The US Senate followed 2 weeks later, and the Ninth Amendment went to the states where it had to be ratified by 3/4 of the then 48 states to be added to the Constitution. The 19th Amendment ratified and part of the US Constitution on August 26, 1920, forever protecting American women's right to vote. But in that precise moment, women's rights movement began. And after its ratification, it will take 4 more years for many Native American even to be considered citizens with voting rights in US, and for some Asian Americans it will take even longer. Many Black women, while possessing suffrage on paper, could not freely exercise the vote until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act barred racially discriminatory voting practices such as literacy tests. I think that, just to come to the present, I think that of the many thousands of women who showed up for the Women's March on Washington in January 2070s, few knew about the suffrage movement in the United States, the women's suffrage movement in the United States, and about the women's suffrage procession of 1913. That was one of the greatest march of women for vote. As the 19th Amendment was adopted, I think that those fighting for women's rights were divided by race, and many of the women who now are marching for women's economic and reproductive rights, they didn't know this. We have now a very clear gender gap in political issues, and now that we are very close to the presidential race, as the case 4 years ago, there is a very wide gender gap in candidate preference. Women's voters continue to favor Democratic candidate for president by 17 percentage points. So 55% to 39%. And this is because women think that the Democrat candidate can better protect women's rights. So 100 years have passed since the United States legally affirmed women's right to suffrage, but the fight for equality continues, especially when it comes to female leadership in many different fields. For instance, in diplomacy is a high prestige, that is a right prestige arena. There is a very strong resistance to the entry of women. So I conclude with the answer. How would foreign policy change if women are protagonists of diplomacy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bezzosi, not only for a very comprehensive historical perspective, but also for provoking the panel with a very pertinent question. As I was listening to your extremely interesting intervention, I couldn't believe how pertinent some of the things that you were talking about seemed today, just a few days ahead of the US presidential elections, with phenomena like restrictions of voters' rights in certain states and sort of phenomena like the first African-American female vice presidential candidate being fielded for the first time in the US history this year, after the first female presidential candidate was fielded by the same party 4 years ago. And we all know how things went back then. But I think your thought-provoking question sets the perfect stage for our next speaker, who is Her Excellency Daniela Rotondaro, Ambassador of the Republic of San Marino in Italy. Because as Professor Bezzosi said, a lot has happened throughout the past 100 years, and a lot remains to be done. And I think one of the major achievements that we've seen in place is really the establishment of an international framework that is meant to protect women's rights. I can think, for instance, of the Convention Against All Form of Violence and Discrimination Against Women that was passed by the UN General Assembly in 1979 and subsequently ratified by 189 countries around the world, including San Marino, of course, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Italy, and many others. And this is just one of the many achievements that diplomacy has contributed to in the field of gender equality. So I want to give the floor to Ambassador Rotondaro to get not only her own personal perspective as a woman who's rising through the ranks of the diplomatic career, but also in terms of having her views on how diplomacy has so far contributed to advancing the gender equality agenda and could contribute in the years to come. Excellency, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Soprano, and thank you very much, Professor Bezzosi, for your inspiring speech. First of all, as you said, I introduce myself. My name is Daniela Rotondaro, and I'm the ambassador of San Marino to Italy, and I also cover the 3 Rome-based agencies, what is called the Polo Unusiano here in Rome. First of all, you're talking about women in diplomacy. And of course, well, I reached this and I will bring you my personal experience to this. But let me just, with a very brief historical background, tell you from where I come and which is my country. My country, I think everybody knows, all the students that are following this lectures. No, that is the smallest republic. It's in Italy. It's the oldest parliamentarian democracy. It was founded in 301, so it has 1,720 years of history. And but as I think, as almost all the European countries, the right to vote to women was.
I'm afraid we're having some trouble hearing you, Ambassador.
Can
you hear us well?
Yes, yes, I can.
I don't know whether it's just on my end. Oh, now we can. Your video has frozen and hear you loud and clear. I hope everyone will hear you as well.
Yeah.
In which case, we can just continue. Please go ahead.
So I was saying that the history of San Marino in what we're talking about, this item, which is 100 years of voting rights to women, unfortunately, is a little bit less, because as most of the European countries, the voting rights in San Marino was given after battles and movements by groups of women coming from different parties, left or right wings, no matter, and it was given at the end of the 60s, exactly 1958, but really women started voting in 1964. And this is what we call voto passivo, while in 97 we had to wait other 9 years to have equal rights as men, and to be able also to be elected as parliamentarians, and this happened only 9 years afterwards. So for more than 100 years, women were subject to a total dependency by men. It was a male-dominated society. If we think that women, their life passed from the father to the husband or to the brother, and didn't have even any right to manage their own personal possessions. So women had the same legal status as minors. Then we have to wait until 1984 for women to reach exactly the same rights, because with marriages, San Marinese women marrying a foreigner would lose her nationality. So only in 84 this has been given to women. It's important to say that today our parliament, which is composed by 60 parliamentarians, we have 30% of women. In the Council of Ministers, at present, we have only one minister, but this is just for the present situation. But compared to other countries, since 1981, we had the first president, which is called for us Captain Regent. We have our system, we have 2 Captain Regents. It's a very democratic system. They stay in charge only 6 months. And since 1981, we already had several women as heads of states of the Republic, which is very important, and a woman serving as head of the Court of Justice. I was thinking, you referred to the different UN conventions, and I was thinking when all our countries gathered in 1995 in Beijing, and where we were all determined to advance the goals of equality, development, peace for women. What have we really achieved? We signed the Istanbul Convention on Violence, the UN protocols, but if we look now at the Agenda 2030, we still see that the goals are there. So of course we have done a lot, but still we have a lot to do if we still have those goals in the agenda. So I think that, of course, a lot of progress has been made, but we still need to overcome those inequalities between men and women. We'll need full participation in women in all decision-making processes. We need to empower women. In our systems, we have not reached equal sharing of responsibilities in the family, between men and women, and unfortunately, women still the burden of the family, children, the elderly, the care of the elderly in our societies is still on women. So we really need to reinforce programs, policies, to develop and to create networks so that women feel themselves comfortable and can think also about their career, develop their career. Let's not forget that we are talking about this side of the world. In other parts of the world, women lack education. Women lack the right to, not only rights, but the right to credit, the right to land, the right to own properties. So we really need that. This still is a long way to go, and we have to put in place mechanisms to help these women. Let's not forget another important issue, which is violence. And I also would like to bring this item nowadays, because violence in the families is an hidden problem also in our societies. And now with pandemia, with COVID-19, where we will have more social inequalities, we will have more economic problems. This impact will be on the more vulnerable, and probably on women. So let's not forget this. And I'm proud to say that just these days we have launched an app that can be you can have it on your mobile phone, which is called Tecum, with the Sammarinese technology, in order to help women to be able to have immediate protection against violence. So another important aspect is that still we are living in a world where we still have stereotypes and cultural and we need to overcome all cultural. We need to change our culture. So this brings me a little bit to my personal experience as a woman, and now as a diplomat. I come from a family of diplomats, and when I was young, I used to tell my father, I want to be like you, I want to be a diplomat. And my father used to tell me, please try to choose another career, a career better fitted for a woman. But, you know, I would, at that time, there were very few diplomats, women. So probably my father had a different culture and perspective. On the other side, my mother was one of the few female that in the late 50s graduated in medicine as with 110 cum laude. So, and she used to say, well, I had to give up my career because for the family and in order to follow my husband around the world. So the same, let's say, the same aspect of the two different aspects of the same coin. I was young, I was tenacious, and so I didn't believe in that, and I I wanted to start this career. Then I got married. And so I understood what my father was saying. I understood my husband's family did not accept my career. They had a stereotyped image of woman and what woman was supposed to do in the family and her work. And he was not willing to follow me in my career. So I had to choose, unfortunately, and I had to give up my private life. So on a personal base, I say that we have to, as a woman, you have unfortunately sometimes to choose. Now we see women in key positions. We see women. We see the doctors, scientists, women in peacekeeping. We see the European Commissioner. We see Mrs. Lagarde, but also we see women that are committed, probably in a more silent way, but they are all committed. So we have to praise their work, and we have to praise how they conciliate the private and public. But I was also thinking that nowadays we are also facing another problem. Women have become independent. Women have become strong. Probably they have to face other problems. And I think that this is also very important. We have to create a new balance in the, otherwise we will create a distortive mechanism among sexes within the family and towards our children. Last, I have to say that I never had problems in my career with men. I had no problems in while negotiating. I had no problems at all. As I said previously, I also cover the 3 Rome-based agencies, and I chair 2 legal committees. One of them deal with appeals that staff of the organization make towards the organization, and it happens that I deal with cases of sexual harassment and abuse of power. But I can really affirm that many cases, if we work on mediation, if we work on cultural changes, many of those situations, of those appeals, can really be avoided. Lastly, one of my worst experiences, unfortunately, in my career was caused by a woman. So I went through mobbing, I went through difficult experiences, and this brought me to think and to really to believe strong that we need to work in a more cohesive manner among women. And I really invite the young generations to think about that, to support yourself. You girls, you and boys, support yourself and work in a more stronger matter. So just to conclude this intervention, I would like to say that for me, as I said previously, is important to change culture, to work in order that equal rights are more and more, because these are the values of all democratic countries. But we also need more commitment by our governments, by the international institutions, by the organizations. And at the same time, we also need more efforts. We women, men in the families, we need to teach that mutual respect and equality are among human values and human rights. We need to teach this to the young generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, not only for sharing how long a way San Marino has come in its road to gender equality, not only for bravely sharing with us some very pertinent stories from your own personal and professional background, also for summarizing what I think all of us would agree are some of the most pressing, outstanding issues on this agenda. You talked about care, and according to some estimates, 75% of the burden of care in terms of domestic chores and care for the elderly and for children within household is done by women, even more so during COVID-19 related lockdowns. You talked about violence, and according to latest figures published by ISTAT, the number of calls made to the toll-free line for anti-violence and anti-stalking made during lockdown here in Italy between March and May rose by 73%. And you talked about stereotypes, and some of you may be familiar with this really interesting, in my opinion, social norm index developed by the UN Development Program, according to which, based on a 75 country survey, 9 in 10 people have at least one gender stereotype. Right? So there's a lot to be done, but at the same time, we're very pleased to have with us a concrete example of a tenacious woman who really has made it in terms of raising through the ranks. You clearly are a female gender champion in your sector, but what I think we also need a lot of to break gender stereotypes is more male champions, right? Because there's a real clear role for men to play in this conversation. And that's why I think we're particularly fortunate to have with us today our next speaker, who is His Excellency Joost Flammen, the Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Italy. Your Excellency, you will have to excuse my presumably terrible Dutch pronunciation of your last name, but I'm really glad to be able to have you on the panel, because you clearly stand in not only as a male champion, and I know that your personal and professional history speaks for you in that sense, also because you represent a country that's clearly managed to establish itself as a global and European gender champion.
Yeah.
As a trade and gender specialist, I remember the time as World Bank and the World Trade Organization, we were working on what then became the WTO ministerial declaration signed at Buenos Aires on trade and women's economic empowerment. And there were a number of countries championing that. And guess who was in the front line? The Netherlands. And that happens at all sides of the board. As an economist, I'm currently working, as a matter of fact, on a World Bank project on gender and trade and female entrepreneurship in West Africa. And guess who is one of the main donors to that program? The Kingdom of the Netherlands. So I really want to thank you so much and your country for their clear and concrete commitment to advancing the gender agenda. And I want to get your perspective in terms of how it has been possible for Netherlands to get where it currently is. And what are some of the best but also bad practices that we could or could not replicate, as many other countries around the world try to catch up with this fantastic threshold that Netherlands has set for us all. So, Your Excellency, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Carmani, and thank you for your very, very kind words. Truly humbling. Okay, my first name is Joost, the second name is Flamand, the first one is unpronounceable for foreigners, the second one is not Dutch, so I thought it was a very brave attempt. Even my fellow countrymen usually mistake terribly. It's an interesting issue you raise. Humbling, I said, in the sense that I'm not at all an expert on this matter in the international sense. I know that the Netherlands enjoys a very good reputation in telling others how to behave and what to do as an expert on how the perfect world should look like. I find it very inspiring if, let's say, if countries set the right example for themselves. And in that, let's say, the other side of the coin of this brilliant example we set in international organizations, and I assume you are more equipped to tell the truth than I am in this regard. At the national level, I think it is slightly less encouraging, to be perfectly honest. Although we didn't start in 301, and it didn't take us until 1984 to have full equal rights, it did take us a very, very, very long time indeed. Far too long, and we're not there yet at all in the Netherlands. Although we've had a number of queens for the past century, we have never had a male prime minister. We do not have equal representation in our parliament. Roughly 1/3 of representatives are women. And for me, always the big question is, why are not more women voting for other women? We have a very unbalanced participation of women in our economy, which is a pity, as it represents half of the labor force. It represents half of the thinking power of a country, half of the capabilities to innovate. But what we see in the Netherlands, for instance, is a large preference for part-time labor. And that is easy explainable, I think, also by the words Ambassador Rotondaro said, because regrettably, it is still the case that most women combine work with care, with children, with household jobs that men simply do not want to do, or are simply not in a position to do. So what is lacking in the Netherlands is a role model, are sufficient role models, and they do not come by themselves. We have basically the curse of part-time work. Women are very happy, but by part-time work, they are gaining basically less money, they're gaining less experience, and therefore their chances for success and getting further ahead in important companies, in important organizations, are less available. So we have to break that pattern. And the government can play an important role, and organizations can play an important role there by providing childcare, very accessible childcare, against affordable prices, by making available flexible working hours, by introducing maternity and paternity leave. All those things, I feel, companies and governments can play a very large role. I'm happy to say that the Netherlands, in that sense, has made some progress, but not enough. So there's plenty of room for improvement. Also in the Netherlands, to give you an example, we still have a discussion on quota for women in the boards of companies. Our numbers are terribly deceiving. Since 2013, we had a so-called a voluntary scheme for companies to amend the situation where women were hardly present in supervisory board and in management boards. It took us 6 years to get to the rather disappointing percentage of 80% women in supervisory boards and 12% only management boards. There you need legislation. You need some helping hand by government to get women on boards, and therefore present role models that are extremely important, and to enforce a different attitude and thinking. And that's, I think, is sort of ties in with my personal experience. I was inspired by Ambassador Rotondaro there. As you may know or may not, I've been active at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a number of years in the task force for diversity and inclusion, in order to promote, in fact, exactly this, the participation of women also in the higher echelons of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not just women, also, let's say, non-Western migrants, elderly, LGBTI, let's say, all those that are not yet in. It's an in against out discussion very often. And I can tell you from my own experience, it takes a lot of time and a continuous effort and incredible perseverance from everybody involved to change, let's say, culture. Because we're talking about culture, either with a capital C or with a small c, as sort of a microcosm of how we behave and what is normal. And sometimes you really need to change that also in companies by setting the right example. Practice what you preach is extremely important, and present, let's say, arguments for the case. Just saying it's the right thing to do usually is not a winning argument for the majority to change tech. But saying, well, we have a business case. There is proof that diverse organizations perform better. They provide better return on investments for shareholders if it comes to private companies, and they generate better ideas when it comes to governments. There's a lot of scientific evidence for that. So if you want to convince the incredulous, you can. It's, let's say, for government institutions, it's also a matter of representation. We want to represent the whole population of the Netherlands. Then you cannot just show elderly white men as I. It's simply not a representative image of what a country is, and especially a country in the Netherlands, where we have, like, at this moment, on 17 million inhabitants, roughly 2 million inhabitants of a non-Western origin. It's time for change. And let's say, we also see that younger generation, they don't accept, let's say, the status quo. And I think I see it at my own children, the whole discussion on, for instance, I have 5 children, to be honest, 3 daughters. So I think for every father, it's clear what the right thing to do is. Make sure that your daughter has an honest chance in the life ahead. But in discussing with my children phenomenon like the Black Lives Matter, you feel how important it becomes, the acceptance of differences, of diversity between people as the new normal. And I'm very hopeful that this may generate a push also in organizations to change. After all, organizations represent, I think, in some sort of a micro version of society. They accept adaptability. They expect adaptability. Newcomers must adapt. That's the way to make a career. Look at how the others do and make you look alike, so you will get ahead. That is something that needs to change. And organizations and society as a whole, I think, and there's, let's say, one influences the other, instead of expecting adaptability, should consider how to make room for newcomers. I think if you take that as a departing point, you will get further. And that requires an integrated approach where all actors and all, let's say, all are activated in playing the part. And that links up, I think, perfectly well with the whole concept of diversity and inclusion. See differences as an asset instead of something that is deviant from a majority, and you will, I think, you will set the right tone for change, because change we must. That struck me in the first intervention by Professor Vezzosi. The year she mentioned, 1884, year of revolution, 1896, ending of the American Civil War, 1920, basically the end of the First World War. You need upheavals in order to break the change. I'm not advocating a revolution here, but let's say, I hope that there is progress in the sense that we're able to generate change without some sort of a clash of a violent nature that precedes that. But it goes to show how difficult it is to change ingrained patterns. One last thing I would like to mention: on COVID. Yes, I've seen the stats on a very worrying trend on domestic violence, for instance. I was just hoping, and Karl Popper in that sense is my preferred philosopher, saying that optimism is a moral duty. I was hoping that the fact that we're all working at home these days might also have an influence in sharing jobs at home and appreciating the work that is done and is not recognized as such. So let's, in this let's say, this optimist note, I would like to conclude my contribution. Thank you.
Never waste a crisis, the saying goes, right? Thank you very much, Your Excellency, not only for a very honest assessment of what things may look like in country in the Netherlands, which maybe not all of us are aware of, but also in terms of touching some very concrete measures that governments and the private sector and practitioners should, and in fact could, work on to try and address some of the challenges we've started to discuss. You talked about the legislation, and I couldn't agree more. Absolutely, we do need legislation, and probably we need something also to accompany legislation, right? In Italy, for instance, we recently had legislation passed to introduce paternity leave, which was subsequently upgraded from 5 days to 7 days, which is not a lot, I'm telling you. And yet, since I happen to believe in that season of life where people of my age start having children, well, I have a lot of male colleagues who, despite having the opportunity of taking paid paternity leave from their jobs, they just didn't. And guess why? Because either their bosses and or their colleagues just wouldn't sort of think that that would be appropriate. And by the way, both bosses and colleagues are predominantly male, right? So we probably don't need a violent revolution. I wouldn't advocate for that either, but we certainly need a cultural revolution, right? And there's a couple more things that we need to see in place. You were talking about childcare. And again, I couldn't agree more that there is a straight line connecting access to childcare services and facilities and female employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. And, I spent a lot of my early years of my career in Washington, and as I would work to the office, would walk to the office every day, I would always pass by this beautiful little nursery that we had in one of our buildings, where all of my colleagues could drop their children as they would run into their own offices. And a lot of private companies were doing exactly the same, subsidizing on-site childcare facilities for all employees and providing it free of charge to them as part of the package of benefits that were part of their contractual arrangements. So absolutely, it is time for change, as you said, and it is time for change at all levels, including in access to education and training opportunities. And that brings us to our next speaker, who is Mrs. Laura Carpini, who is Minister Plenipotentiary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Development Cooperation here in Rome, but is also the president of the Italian Diplomatic Women Association. She's not only another great gender female champion, providing a clear demonstration of how a talented and tenacious woman can rise through the ranks of the diplomatic career, but she also happens to currently occupy a role that again belongs to an industry that has traditionally been dominated by men. She is in fact currently the head of cybersecurity at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Rome. And if UNESCO stats, for instance, tell us that out of the 750 million illiterate adults around the world, 2/3 are women, most of whom are located in developing countries. When it comes to developed country contexts like ours, I'm sure we would all agree that a lot of issues have to do with women's access to training and professional opportunities in the so-called STEM sectors, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So I really want to take the opportunity of Mrs. Carpini's intervention, not only to get her own perspective as a diplomat working on these issues, female diplomat, but also to have her views from her current role as head of a department that traditionally has been dominated by women. So Mrs. Carpini, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Soprano, and thank you for having me. It's really a great panel, and thank you for this kind introduction. Let me first pick up on some points that have been touched upon by previous speakers because they were very, very interesting. First of all, of course, from the historical point of view, we have indeed come a long way from the history that Professor Vezzosi told us about, the history of the American progression of women, but also from our side in Italy, you know that we were granted the right to vote in 1946, and subsequently we had our constitution approved and entered into force in 1948, which for the first time established that all citizens are equal without discrimination of sex and race, religion, and so on and so forth. But the reason I mentioned Article 3 of the Constitution is that Article 3 of the Constitution is composed of two parts. The first one being the formal part, like no formal discrimination, but the second part is already foreseeing the substantial part of discrimination. And this is what we have been talking about so far, because it says that the Republic needs to remove the obstacles that hinder the full participation of all these citizens to the life, to fulfill their own potential and participate in civil life. Which brings me to the key concept. The key concept is not only that we are promoting gender equality for the sake of fairness and justice for women, but also for the benefit and the progress of our society, which is something that the ambassador of the Netherlands just touched upon, inclusiveness and the best use of the best resources of each citizen is key to the progress and the well-being of our citizens and society. So this is the framework we are moving in, and of course, since gender discrimination is probably one of the most ancient and widespread form of discrimination of humanity in history, we have come a long way, but cultural stereotypes and obstacles are really rooted. And the legislative framework that we have is not enough, and we need to overcome cultural obstacles and get affirmative action and policies. And by affirmative actions, I don't mean only quotas. In Italy, we have a legislation for quotas in the private sector, Legge Golfo-Mosca, which is currently working well, but kind of best practices and policies that need to touch and tackle gender equality in all its aspects of life. And in fact, I think that it's a very good moment, the one we're living, to be, I want to be optimistic, like the ambassador of the Netherlands as well, because in a way, the pandemic not only has forced us to be all at home, and therefore, as he said, possibly men are starting to understand what it takes to be home and to combine jobs and not to be recognized for what you do. But also there is a growing awareness in Italian women about their potential, that what they are doing. And if you notice, after the famous notorious task force's decision, there was a vocal engagement by Italian women that prompted some decisions by the government. And the government seemed to be very committed and very aware. In fact, a motion was passed in May, so the government is engaged and committed now to make some decisions and to try to overcome the glass ceiling. And also the Ministry of Equal Opportunity is working on a national strategy on gender equality, which is precisely going to do that. So tackle concretely some aspects of everyday life in order not only to accompany this perfect and very progressive legal framework with concrete actions. because without actions, we will never make it, because cultural legacies, negative legacies are too rooted to be, we should wait too long before we get full equality without any form of intervention. One other positive element that I'd like to mention is what happened with Regione Puglia, and when the government first applied Article 120 of the Constitution to step in before the regional elections, because Regione Puglia hadn't adapted to the law that obliges regions to observe the double gender preference in electoral regions. So you see, there are many signs that we are progressing steadily, and this would conclude, I think, my national part, and I will come to my diplomacy part. So one government is active in promoting gender equality. One nation is active in promoting gender equality internally, but also externally. And there, diplomacy and foreign policy come into the picture. For Italy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, gender issues have been always at the core of its foreign policy. Currently, we are members of the Human Rights Council, and gender equality is one of the priority topics. Also, 2020 is an important date, an important anniversary for another reason. It's the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 of the Security Council of the United Nations, and the one that established the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And Italy supported it immediately and complied with it. And we have already implemented our third national plan towards to implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which conceives the role of women not only as a target and beneficiary of protection in times of war, but also as a positive and effective actor of peace. And that's where, and this plan, the Italian Parliament for the last national plan has devoted 4 million euro, and the fourth plan is being devised. Now, within this plan, we participate in the networks for this agenda and in the informal task force of the EU. And it's a work in progress, because it needs a lot of work. Indeed, women are considered to be very positive actors of peace. It has been proven that when women are mediators, the duration of the peace agreements that are reached, it's longer. But so far, figures say that between 1990 and 2017, only 2% of women's mediators have been recorded, 8% of women negotiators, and 5% of women signatories of peace agreements. So that's a percentage that really needs to be increased, because again, international peace and stability will highly benefit from the participation of women in peace processes. And within this engagement, Italy has also created a network of women mediators in the Mediterranean, which is something that we've been working on for the past 3-4 years. The network comprises today 50 women from different countries. And finally, the point you were mentioning, gender and technology. Now, that's something that puzzles me and will keep puzzling me for the next years, because on one hand, technology solutions and progress offers an enormous potential of development and empowerment for women. But on the other hand, and this is happening everywhere in the world, women seem to be reluctant because, again, of cultural reasons, to take education in STEM topics. And that limits their participation in the professional sector. And if we think that digitalization is just becoming our daily activity and will pervade all aspects of our life, you can easily gather that most professions will, most jobs, top-ranking jobs, if we continue with this level of skills from women, most top jobs will be held by men. And that's something that might risk to undermine the progress we have done so far. And the other aspect, again, is that there will be less negotiator in cybersecurity or technological security matters at international level. And if you think of artificial intelligence, most artificial intelligence is programmed, devised, and implemented by men. And that is something that, you know, can raise questions because each one of us has an unconscious bias. And women also have unconscious biases, each one of us. So if you limit the production and project of new technologies to half of the society, then the other half will benefit or be, will be excluded probably by this progress. So that's a kind of negative aspect I would like to flag, but I don't want to conclude on a negative note. And overall, as I said, we have done a lot of progress, and especially in international relations, the role of women in peace and security has been widely acknowledged, and is always being successful. So I think I'll stop here, and I thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Carpini. It sounds to me like Karl Popper style optimism is now becoming the common denominator of this panel discussion, which I think is absolutely great. And on that note, I really want to thank Mrs. Carpini for her fantastic intervention and for, among other reasons, reminding us all that indeed there's a lot more reason to remember 2020 than just COVID-19, because indeed of the anniversary of the 1325 UN Security Council resolution. In my work as a development practitioner, I spend a lot of times in post-conflict zones in sub-Saharan Africa, and I still have vividly in my memory these images of extraordinary women doing agricultural cross-border trade between Eastern DRC and Rwanda and Uganda, who, as you probably know, were war-torn zone for about 2 decades. And the power and the passion and the incredible contribution that these women were making to peace building and prolonged prosperity was absolutely stunning and very much undervalued, I must admit. But coming back to the topic with which we opened Mrs. Carpini's intervention, the role of women in technology and STEM sectors, I think this offers us the perfect opportunity to pass the floor to our final speaker of today, who is Mr. Roberto Zecchino, a Vice President, Human Resources and Organization at Bosch Group Italy, which, as you all certainly know, is a well-established multinational company that's been active for several decades precisely in the technological industry. Roberto, you really have the opportunity here not only to sort of make your own conclusions about what's been said so far, but also to pick up on one very important point that I think Ambassador Fleming made, which is about the business case for gender equality, which is indeed crystal clear, as he rightly said. Some of you may remember a 2015 McKinsey report that came out about the business case for gender equality, flagging that if all gender gaps were closed by 2025, up to $28 trillion could be added to the world's GDP. and also identifying the fact that companies that actively invest into gender and diversity, as the ambassador Flaman was saying, have 15% higher earnings than companies that do not do that. So the business case is crystal clear, and yet we're not that yet. But at the same time, we do have the opportunity with you, Roberto, to learn more about some of the incredible initiatives that Bosch has been launching precisely in the field of providing access to technical training and mentoring opportunities for young people, and especially young women in the technological sector. So I really want to take the opportunity of your intervention, Roberto, to share a little bit more of these fantastic best practices about the experience of Bosch, and also for your own conclusions about anything that has been said so far. So Mr. Zucchino, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity for presenting Bosch, our experience in diversity. First of all, as you can see also behind me, there are our values. And one of our values is for sure diversity. Diversity is not a program, it's an attitude. I think diversity is to promote minorities. Diversity is an attitude, and especially a way of thinking. I personally, as HR, I work quite intensively in our company in order to promote, let's say, the discussion according with the diversity. Of course, we have heard diversity, it's gender diversity, which is one aspect, but I think that in a company, we really have to recognize diversity in terms of variety of way of thinkings, experience, perspective for all our associates. You mentioned a study, McKinsey study, that shows very clear that a winning team in a private company like Bosch, or other in public organization, is where the diversity is part of the day-to-day activities. Personally, I'm not in favor of a quota for diversity. Of course, for an initial period can be useful to have targets about, here we are talking about gender diversity, about a percentage. But I think it's really the culture that has to change. Of course, Bosch is a multinational company, is a German company, is a foundation. So in our pillar, in our let's say, day-to-day activity, we understand that we really need to start also at the school level. Of course, school level means that as a company, we need to promote the diversity and let the young student understand that we can be successful in a private or public companies, no matter the let's say the inclination, no matter the gender that we are. So we need to promote the possibility that each person can develop a career inside a company, in this case inside Bosch, independently about gender, about age, about other inclination that we may have. So we see diversity as an advantage, and we see also that everyone is part of this culture of inclusion, no matter in which nation, in which culture, and in which company that we are working. So our approach at Bosch is to make internally and externally, let's say, a large campaign of communication. I think the communication is part of our, let's say, task, but especially we wanted to be a role model. So we must create a climate in which differences are valued, and working in the human resources, I need to be sure to make a positive use of diversity in our operating unit. So, of course, we need to be, we need to learn from the difference, and we need also to understand, having a presence at Bosch in almost more than 100 countries, that diversity is a daily work. Again, is not a program. We cannot launch, of course, we need to launch initiative, we need to launch communication, but then every leader has to talk, but has to act. So if in my team, I'm an ambassador for diversity, I need to show that in my team, I have a mixed team of group, nationalities, gender, etc., etc., etc. So it's important to discuss, but it's even more important to act. So again, I'm not a fan of quota, but of course, if we see the case of Bosch, Bosch is a multinational company. We are very linked with the production. We are hiring a lot of engineers. So each of you that knows the engineer world, we know from a percentage point of view that the presence at the University of Engineering are 60% male, even more for some mechanical, electronic engineers. So of course we need to try to balance, but this is a little bit the experience of Bosch. We need also to communicate to the young generation, especially at the age of 10, 12, 14 years old, that in the future, the labor market for male and female is definitely more open for, let's say, technical background instead of humanistic background. This is a fact. Of course, we inform, but then each of students, they have to follow their own passion. So my experience at Bosch, it's really that we really have to give the, let's say, the attention, and of course to act day by day in order, let's say, to improve, in order to recognize, in order really to put the diversity as a pillar of our daily life. In the professional life, but I have to say, having two daughters, I have to say it's a kind of lead by example. Even as a father, I really have to respect let's say, the female part of my family, let's say, acting, let's say, in a positive way, which give the opportunity really to follow the own passion, no matter which are, let's say, the social, the cultural, and the economical condition. So this is a little bit the experience at Bosch. Of course, is a journey. Journey means that we need really to work day by day on the diversity, and of course it's an experience that we can share at all level, private and public. That's my, let's say, contribution for the today conference.
That was an amazing contribution, Mrs. Aquino. Thank you so, so much. So diversity is an attitude, but also daily work. And I really like that Bosch mantra. So I reckon we're almost out of time, but I think we all need to recognize that we have about 100 really bright and fairly impertinent, I'm told, students who have been very patiently listening to us all for the past 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I really want to give an opportunity to not all of them, unfortunately, at least some of them, to ask some questions. I suggest we take 3 questions from our virtual audience, and then we pass them around the virtual table to see whether any of our fantastic speakers wishes to answer them. We'll take all 3 of them together, and then we'll go around for us. Who wants to go first?
So if it is not an issue, I'd go first. My question is pretty broad, and still, I hope it's not too broad. I'm Gabriele Diana, global governance student of the 2nd year. I'm from Rome. And I wanted to ask a question, because I've heard the ambassadors talking very much from their national point of view about the fight for women's rights and equality. But what came to my mind at the end of this conference is that, and it is truly a question that I want to pose, is it good to fight only on a national level, or should we take into consideration also more a longer game? And intersectional feminism too comes to my mind as the fight for different kind of inequalities put together. And I don't know, because the creator of the ideator of intersectional feminism thought that not all inequalities are created equal, and so that they must be taken into account as one. And so I do not know if it is actually useful to fight only on a national level, but it is also very much more complex. And so I'd ask the ambassadors from their personal experience if it is actually possible to do something like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diana. Let's see whether there are any other questions. Please, anybody else?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear, Mrs. Palmer. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Costanza Balmer. I'm a 2nd year global governance student. And I wanted to thank you all for the very inspiring presentations that you gave. It was very interesting listening to everyone. And my question is, I would be very interested in hearing what you think of what I think is a closely related topic to what we talked about today. And I also think it's a topic that is not being discussed a lot, maybe because it's a delicate topic, or I feel it's very hidden in society. What I'm trying to say is, I feel that the discrimination towards women throughout the years has also created, obviously, problems for women, but also it has had reflections on the lives of men. And so my question is, what do you think of what is happening also to men due to discrimination towards women, such as examples, for example, a boy cries and his father tells him, be a man, or at dinners with colleagues, someone might ask a man, oh, your wife works and you stay at home with the children. Isn't that degrading? And I think that this is a very important topic to be discussing, especially when we're talking about equal rights. And I think it's a very toxic environment. And that's it. I just wanted to know what you all thought about this. Thank you again for the presentations.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Palmer. And then for speaking, we got a third question in the chat box from a colleague of yours, Mrs. Ariana Mavilla, who wrote, and I quote and synthesize, I believe that in order to achieve gender equality, we need men to play an active role and to really embrace this fight. My question is, what can we as women do in order to encourage more men to speak up and be actively involved in it? What an impertinent set of questions right there. That's great. Thank you very much, guys. So who wants to take any of these questions from our distinguished speakers? Please, anybody come forward. Ambassador, I see you ready to go ahead. So why don't you?
Which ambassador?
This one. That's a good point.
Well, I'm willing to say something, but I'm not sure whether you were referring to me. Okay, I'll go ahead. Otherwise, I'll just consume more time. National versus broader, if I understood the question correctly. Well, the point is that national governments usually legislate at the national level, but of course, as we heard, there is also an international dimension. We've heard the very important work in the context of the United Nations. UNSCR 1325 was mentioned, and so much more work. In the Council of Europe, a lot has been done. In the ILO, well, both things are extremely important, but of course, national governments work at the national level. Absolutely, on the discrimination and the impact on men, it's about accepting let's say, the differences in behavior. So not impose on men to behave like men and women to behave like women. And one has a consequence for the other. And that is very difficult from my own experience. I remember vividly that I tried to make right of my legal use to take paternity leave after my first child was born. And that my boss basically said, well, then you have to quit this department because we certainly cannot do with men taking care of their children 1 day a week. Now, that was the attitude. And that is not even 20 years ago at the foreign ministry where I lived. That has changed, luckily, but you need role models. You need people that say, well, sod it, I'm going to do it anyway. So live with it and suck it up. And it's difficult. It takes courage, and just do it. And what women can do is encourage those men, and what men can do is encourage those women to take their rightful place and ensure equality and the possibility to be yourself. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Excellency, I think Mrs. Carpini wanted to also say something, and I also see Mr. Zecchino ready to speak. So why don't you go ahead?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, I don't know if I understood the first question correctly. It seemed to me the student was implying that we pursue our policies on a national basis only, but in fact we have coordination within the EU, and what I refer to the agenda of policy, women, peace and security is dealt with at the United Nations level. So it's a global goal we pursue within all our fields and avenues of cooperation. We do it bilaterally with other countries and also in multilateral settings. But I'm not sure this is what he was asking for, so I beg his pardon if it's not what he was expecting. On the other two questions, I think, again, as Ambassador Flamand said earlier also, men should be also a target of the fight for gender equality, because it is evident that without their contribution, support and involvement, nothing will change. And if I might be not very diplomatic. Perhaps they can, it's very difficult. They perceive, my impression as having been dealing with this topic for some years at also the level of the Association of Women Diplomats, is there's a sort of perception of being the turkey before Thanksgiving. The perception of men towards, many men towards gender equality issues is what they gain, I lose. And that's precisely where we have to explain that it's, again, for the benefit of the entire society. I always like to draw the similarity of the farmer and who has 2 cows and has to make butter. If he milks the 2 cows and keeps one bucket of milk and another bucket of milk for the second cow, and he makes butter with with only one bucket, and it doesn't mix the 2 buckets of milks, the butter will be less creamy. So this is precisely what is happening what has been happening in our societies. For every role, we have wasted women's talent, the talent of women versus that are talented in mathematics, and we have wasted the talent of men who are passionate and very caring fathers. So we have to explain this as also a form of liberation of other talents for men, because in a way men are also being prisoners of stereotypes, as Costanza was precisely saying. So this is the way we have to present this, at least this is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carpini. And then very quickly over to Mr. Zecchino, and then I know Professor Vezzosi also wants to make an intervention, and then we'll close the panel just a few minutes over the scheduled time. Please, Mr. Zecchino.
Yeah, very quickly, my answer will be, let's always be ourselves. So be yourself. Of course, we need, as a company, really to push very hard in order to promote a gender equality company. For example, very quickly, in the other company are promoting a very important role, a female manager during the maternity leave. That was a bit, some other colleague, they say, why you are doing this during the maternity leave? I say, what's the problem? We can promote in any time. So again, I was myself. So for me, it was not that different about the timing where we are promoting the person, because in this period, she was on maternity leave, but it was not at all a problem. So for me, and again, I'm myself also when I'm working and when I'm taking, let's say, some decision, no matter of gender. Another topic is the equal pay. I never thought 1 second in my entire career to pay less or more because of gender. But again, I am myself, and I will challenge my colleague internally and externally if they are thinking that a male or female should earn less or more because of gender or because the sexual inclination. So my suggestion also for the young student, in the future, you can make the difference. You will take decision that they will impact on this subject. So be yourself during the study, also be during your daily activities.
Thank you, Mr. Zecchino. What a wonderful success story when you told us about this promotion of a female manager during her maternity leave. Professor Vezzosi.
For me, natural, no really discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Bezzosi, we started this fantastic discussion with you. We're going to close it with you. So you'll get a chance to give your views about the questions we got from our fabulous students on the line. Please, the floor is yours.
I try to give the two very short answer to the problem of involvement of men in women's and gender equality issues. The first one is the importance of school. From primary school on, just to deconstruct stereotypes and rules. And I think it's very important. And family is important too, but school is very important. And the second one is that women as to involve men in movement and gender policies, and in reconceptualize some notions, some very important notions in our daily life, and in organization, and in politics, and in family. And these notions are power and leadership. I think that if we realize that leadership is not alone a single leadership, but maybe a collective leadership. And if we think about power, that power is not just power on someone, but is power with someone. We succeeded in changing the involvement of men. It's not easy, but I think we need to think together new ways to define notion that we generally think as single and not as collective. So it's a long way maybe, but I think we are ready to do this. And if we think about the movement in the United States, but even in Italy, the women's movement, it was involving men in the last years. So I think that many steps are just done.
Thank you very much, Professor Bezzosi. We're clearly over time here, so I will just try and wrap this fabulous discussion up by quoting words or stories that have stayed with me as I was listening to all of our fantastic speakers. So this year we celebrate 100 years from the first time women voted in the United States, and thank God we've moved so much away from that horrific cult of true humanhood that Professor Bezzosi opened the panel discussion with. That's precisely why we get to hear about wonderful stories like the one of Her Excellency Rotundaro, who very kindly wanted to share her personal story with us, and also to get many other female champions, including those that we have around the virtual table today. It is clearly time for change, and as His Excellency Flamand rightly said, we have a very clear business case for gender equality, but we're not going to be able to leverage that business case until we're together in this, men and women. Because to quote Mrs. Carpenter's metaphor, we don't not only want the butter creamy, we want it super creamy. And so we really need to be able to work together on that butter making process. And then last but not least, as Mr. Zucchino reminded us all, this is daily work, right? It's not something that happens overnight. It's taken us a century or more. We still have a rocky road ahead. But on a closing note, let me add this from my own personal perspective. I'm truly delighted that we were able to have this discussion, which as an official from an international organization, I think truly represent that multilateral integrated approach that I believe Ambassador Flamand was talking about. Different experts and practitioners bringing together their perspective and being united by a common cause. I was also very happy to be able to have the audience of so many bright students with us. I'm really hoping that the words and the experiences that our panelists share with them can be of inspiration to them so that they can become the gender champions of tomorrow. I want to thank you all very much for having stayed with us today. I also want to apologize for having gone a little bit beyond the time schedule. And I also want to conclude by saying that this gender panel is over for today. We have 7 more days to go and a very full and really exciting schedule for this 11th edition of the Diplomacy Festival. So please stay tuned and continue watching. Thank you very much, everybody. You have a lovely evening, a fantastic weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye
you.
to all.
Thank
Bye-bye
you.
to all.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao.
Dottor Soprano, grazie.
Grazie a voi.
Mi è sembrata un'ottima sessione, quindi la ringrazio del suo tempo.
Grazie a voi e grazie per il fantastico lavoro dalle quinte. Saluti a Giorgio, che credo sia Giorgio Signor, che credo sia lì con lei. Sento la voce. Arrivederci e buon lavoro, alla prossima, buona serata.